Hi everyone, my name is Soila Kenya. I'm here to provide some bookish content, book reviews, book analysis. I'm also here to recommend some books to you guys, and you guys should also recommend stuff for me to read as well. Let's all expand our reading universes. Today, I'll be talking about a book called A Dead Djinn in Cairo. This is a book that came out in 2016, but I read it last year and I read it again this year. It's just 40 pages, so for those of you who don't like reading too much or don't like reading such long books, this is a good one. I'll begin by explaining the context of the book because I need to explain the context before I explain the plot, because otherwise the plot won't make sense. This book is primarily fantasy sci-fi, but it's a particular genre called steampunk. Now, steampunk is elements of the early 20th century, usually England, so like the end of the Victorian era, combined with futuristic elements like technology and machines. And the whole idea is because it's more than just a literary genre, it's also like a fashion aesthetic. And the whole idea is combining the aspects of the early, the industrialization period. So, like the word steampunk comes from steam powered machines, like trains and things like that, that were prevalent in that era, and combining them with like futuristic things like robots and machines and things that didn't actually exist in that time. So I really like this genre because it combines the past with the future, which is like, if you think about it, it's like crazy cool. And this is what this book is. Actually, if anyone asks me what steampunk is in terms of when it comes to literature, this is a really good example. I would say just imagine Sherlock Holmes, like the original Sherlock Holmes. For those who watch movies a lot, the Sherlock Holmes that had Robert Downey Jr. Think of that Sherlock Holmes combined with elements of magic and paranormal things like ghouls, angels, jinns, sorcerers, wizards, witches, cults. And then you have the setting for this book. So this book is about an investigator. It's actually a murder mystery novel, and it's good I mentioned Sherlock Holmes. It's kind of similar, but it's set in Cairo in Egypt, which is just, yes, amen to that. Amen to steampunk existing outside of England. And the book starts with, we're introduced to special investigator Fatma El Sha'arawi, and she's the main character in this novel. She's the investigator who we follow as she solves mystery. She works for the Ministry of Alchemy, Enchantments, and Supernatural Entities. Now that just gave me serious vibes of like the Ministry of Magic in Harry Potter, but it was not, it didn't feel like it was trying to rip off Harry Potter or anything, but I just remembered that when I saw it. But that's super cool. And her partner is a special consultant from the police force called Inspector Asim Sharif, and their characters really play off each other. I don't know, I guess they sort of act as foils for each other. In literature, a foil is characters that are super opposite to each other and therefore bring out each other's characteristics more. So the more, for example, the more introverted this character is, the more you'll see the extrovertedness of this other character, because they're clashing so much in terms of how they react to things. He's sort of fatherly, he's a bit of a big guy, and he has this vibe of, he says like back in my day or back in my grandfather's day all the time. And Fatma she's very fashionable. She wears suits. Sis wears suits, bespoke suits, and she carries a cane. It is for aesthetic purposes, not that she needs it. And she wears a bowler hat. So it's very like, she dresses like an Englishman actually. And they work off each other. So the book starts when she arrives at the scene of the crime and a djinn has been found dead. So a djinn is a genie, and in this world, the supernatural exists together with human beings. Like, it's out in the open. Not all supernatural entities are like acceptable and part of society, but jinns are part of the supernatural race that is part of society. They work in the open. And so a djinn has been found dead and the police force has been called, and Fatma from the ministry has been called as well because it's a supernatural crime. So basically what happens is that it looks like a suicide, but then it ends up not being a suicide, or it ends up being more than just a suicide, let me put it like that. And she finds clues there, or they find clues there, that lead them on a journey throughout the night, because they find the body, or they're called in, it's like evening or night. And so the book is just that one night, as she solves the crime. And because it's 40 pages, I won't really describe too much more because I feel like I'll already be spoiling things. What I like about this book, the first thing is the main character, Fatma El Sha'arawi, the investigator. She is such an interesting character. I can't believe this guy was able to do this in 40 pages, but he was able to do what other books that are way longer fail to do. When we say we want badass female characters, we don't necessarily want like someone who is perfect and like, you know, clean, like, you know, just cannot do any wrong. Fatma comes across as very dynamic and she's not perfect because this is a mystery novel. There's of course a bit of action and fighting at some point, so she does do that, but it's not that like she perfectly saves the day and it's clean cut and everybody goes home and happy ending. There's a bit of things she faces where it's like, okay, what's happening here? And that makes sense. That's real life. And again, I said she wears a suit. Like, come on. Like, she has such a good fashion sense. I was like, wow. It's interesting to see a badass female character who has good fashion sense. Because I feel like what happens is that if you have someone who can fight, they usually don't have good fashion sense. So it's like we can't be pretty and badass at the same time. So Fatma is breaking down those walls hugely. Something else is that she has such a great sense of humor. Like it's kind of, I guess it would be described as dry humor, and like not everyone always gets her jokes, and she's like her internal monologue of people's reactions to her jokes are really funny. But like, yeah, she's really good as a character. Something else is the imagery in this book is to die for. There's tons and tons of subtext, and the subtext goes in hand with the imagery. There's so many gems and like just things sprinkled in this book that are not explained in depth but build the world for you. I could very clearly picture this Cairo of 1912. That's when the book takes place. It's not the Cairo that exists now, neither is it the Cairo that existed in actual 1912 because of all these supernatural elements. But it is so clear in my mind because of how much subtext has been fit in. There's a lot of descriptions, a lot of descriptors, and it gives a really good picture of the Arab world. So of course it's taking place in Cairo, but they mention Sudan, they mention Abyssinia, which is Ethiopia. They give a lot of hints to so many other places and so many things without actually going in depth. That is such a gem in itself because in fantasy, writers can hardly stop themselves from over explaining and info dumping. A good example is probably The Lord of the Rings. Like, honestly, I have not read The Lord of the Rings, but in high school, a friend gave me The Hobbit, and I read about maybe 150 to 100 pages. I'm not sure whether by the time I stopped reading, they had actually gotten into characters doing things, but a lot of it was just pages upon pages of explanation of things. And I'm like, okay, but can the characters start doing stuff? This book is so good at that. As the characters are doing the things, as Fatma and Asim are going through the motions of solving the crime, we are still getting loads of explanation of the world of the book. So like the world building is done on the move. Sustainable writing, guys, it's 2020. Let's go green. As I mentioned, there's a lot of supernatural stuff, jinns, ghouls, angels, I don't know, just lots of things. And it all seems so natural. Like that, those are not things that actually exist, but it seems so natural because of the descriptions. It's just such a nice experience reading this book because of that. Like it's like such a refreshing experience. Just very refreshing. It's very yummy experience. I don't know how else to describe it. I'll just read a few paragraphs, I think one or two, from the book just to give you a bit of insight into some of the things I'm saying I like about this book. So the first is Fatma's wit and like her like bits of sassiness, stroke, humor. Just listen to this. So what's happening here is Fatma is talking to Asim and he asks or he says, always wanted to know why the Englishman's suit. He gestured at her clothing. We kept them out thanks to the Djinn, sent them running back to their cold, dreary little island. So why dress like them? Fatma flicked the rim of the black bowler she donned, crossing her leg to show off a pair of caramel wingtips. Jealous I can outdress you? Now you can definitely see this is page 14, but her character is already coming out really strong. Another thing is the imagery in this book and the effectiveness of the words. No word is wasted. Every word is important. Listen to this. The jambia had been given to her by a visiting as dignitary, a present for banishing a particularly nasty nanas troubling his clan. It had been one of her first assignments at the ministry. The half-blind old man had called her pretty for a young man, so brave to take on a half-Jinn. She hadn't corrected him, and she'd kept the knife. So at the beginning of that paragraph, she mentions a jambia, which we don't know what that is at this point, unless of course you know what it is. But I didn't know what that was at the beginning. But by the end of it, it ends with, and she'd kept the knife. So I now know it's a knife. It was very quick, and I found that such an effective way of writing. And it's just very like saving on words and saving on time, basically. The only thing I would think about this book that would make it better is, one, this guy can really write. Like, he can get away with doing a graphic novel. If he can partner with an artist, this story would work really well, or a similar story would work really well as a comic or as a graphic novel, because it's really suited to that genre, and also the length is really suited to that genre, of that, medium, because of all the fantastical elements. Like, even without having it drawn out, I could see how this would work really well if you just, added some visual elements to it. Another thing is, I think it would really work well as a series. And I don't mean a series like Harry Potter or Game of Thrones, where it's like a long one narrative split into many books. But I mean a series like Nancy Drew or Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot series of murder mysteries. And I don't know why this format of telling stories is mostly done with children's books, like Nancy Drew, for example. I think this would work really well like that. Like a case, each book is a different case that she's solving, basically. And I mean, it can go on as long as the author wants it to. And there's no one long narrative, or there could be, I don't know. But this book would work really well like that, honestly. And also, I just want more of this world. Like, it was painted really well in my mind, and I feel like it's something that could exist somewhere in the universe. And I guess I just don't want to give it up, but I'll be definitely reading more from this author. There's at least one book of his that I know I definitely will read and probably review here. So this book is definitely worth a read. It's quite high-paced because it's 40 pages, so, there's no time. And it was written by an African-American historian. And maybe it's because he's a historian that he has so much context of a culture he's not from. But I found it surprising that this was not someone who's Egyptian who's written this book, because I was super convinced that that had to be the case, but he's not. The context that's given, it calls back to so many historical things around the Arab world. And they're talked about so naturally that I was just like, okay, what? How is this guy not from there? Maybe it's because he's a historian. And I feel like this is how representation is done. If you're going to write about other cultures, do some serious research so that it doesn't seem contrived and like you're forcing things. I hope I've convinced you to read this book. Again, it's just 40 pages. You can knock it out in one sitting and, mark one more book that you've read. I heard about it first. I think I saw it first on Goodreads. Yes, some of us still use Goodreads. Personally, I hardly read physical books, so I use Goodreads as a way to just keep shelves and know what I've read and what I'm reading. And I think someone I follow had read it, and that's how I stumbled across it. Otherwise, it's like super low-key. I've not heard it being talked about, but it's such an exciting book that it really needs to be talked about more. But yeah, thanks for joining me. I will leave my social media links in the description, along with my Goodreads for those people who are also on Goodreads, or if you just want to click on the link and see what I'm reading. This is the first video on this channel, so I don't think you're gonna subscribe, but if you follow me somewhere on social media, then you'll know when I'm posting next. Thanks for joining, and see you next time.